Hello, everyone. I'm Avery Irons, the Associate for Technical Assistance at the New York State Youth Justice Institute. Thank you for joining us for the afternoon of Day 3 of Are the Kids All Right? COVID-19 and Youth. This afternoon, we bring to you our panel on out-of-home care settings, and we thank our excellent resources of scholars, advocates, and practitioners who are here with us today. Before we introduce them, though, I want to offer a few key themes from our panels, the previous panels that we've had during this event, so that we can connect those discussions to our conversations today. And I want to invite you to view those conversations also on the YJI's Facebook page. So we started off on Tuesday with our homes panel, and one of the key, or some of the key takeaways that really resonated with that panel and the participants in the audience was the notion that children are not resilient. They are absorbent, and need community supports to thrive. The current drastic cuts in services means that the youth and families who were already at risk, especially those who cannot access internet-based services, are now even more at risk. Our communities panel that afternoon talked to us about how we can center healing by addressing systemic conditions that led to someone's trauma, making sure that institutions like schools practice healing work by financially investing in healing responses and expanding our definition of data to include stories of lived experiences and other non-quantitative sources of information. Day 2 was our Justice Systems Day, in which we had Justice Systems panel in the morning and the afternoon. Justice Systems 1 really brought home for us the idea that the pandemic is a racial and economic crisis that illustrates the impact of segregation, unemployment, lack of healthy food access, and other inequities that communities of color suffer. All of these are also connected to the justice system. Healing is not linear or perfect. Workers and agencies should try to track and understand what is happening to the people they serve, remove judgment, and seek creative community partnerships to adopt a family-centered approach to understand these needs. In our Justice Systems 2 panel that afternoon, we talked about how we should put our values first, meet people where they are, and have their needs guide our research. The money exists for a strong network of reentry support and services for youth. We should identify and fund community-based services that benefit kids and move services from detention centers to communities. We can create something better, they reminded us and inspired us. And this morning we had our education panel in which our experts really impressed upon us that we have to consider the roles of schools as a conduit to learning and health as we support youth and families through this moment of double trauma. This means assessing and being responsive to the needs of youth and families as they tell us. And this also means that we have to do this while considering and rethinking our current notions of what are our basic needs and basic rights of all stakeholders in this equation, from funding and funding accountability for systems to internet and tech as a basic right for youth and families, as well as physical and mental health service access. So, with that, I'm super excited to help us move into our conversation today on the experiences of youth in at-home settings. We also want to cover a couple of housekeeping matters that I will start off just by saying if you have technical issues while you're participating in this webinar, please contact the Youth Justice Institute directly. We can be reached at youthjustice@albany.edu. That link should be appearing in the chat box about now. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Alicia for more housekeeping.
Hello all, my name is Alicia and I'm a research assistant at the Youth Justice Institute. Thank you again for joining us today. As our presenters today are speaking, you are welcome to ask questions in the Q&A section or in the Facebook comments as we go along. We should have some time at the end of this session for these questions, but in case we don't get to all of them, we are keeping track and we'll do our best after the conclusion of this forum to answer the remaining questions. Today, we have Angelique McAlpine of Drawing Impact providing live digital visual note-taking. Her screen will be projecting alongside the panelists' videos. You can adjust the relative size of the panelists' videos and Angelique's drawings by shifting the vertical sliding bar to the left or to the right to suit your preference. This session and all of our sessions are being recorded and will be available to watch at a later point. And now I'll turn it on to Samaria.
Hi everyone, my name is Samaria and I'm a Youth Justice Institute scholar. We would like to invite you to engage your fellow attendees throughout the week and afterwards on our online Padlet board, which we'll link in the chat. This is a virtual bulletin board intended to serve as a collaboration and networking space similar to at a professional in-person conference. On Padlet, as well as in the Zoom chat, please remember to be constructive and kind as we move through this conversation together. And now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Giza Lopez, Executive Director of the New York State Youth Justice Institute, to present some opening remarks as we begin this session.
Thanks so much, Samaria and Avery and Alicia. Good afternoon. If you're new to our event, welcome. If you joined us in past discussions throughout the week, welcome back to the New York State Youth Justice Institute's Forum on COVID-19 and Youth. My name is Giza Lopez, and I'm the Executive Director of the YJI. We have quite a diverse audience here today. Many of you come from local and state governments all over the country, as well as universities, nonprofits, and research centers from near and far. Thank you very much for joining us and for your endurance in coping with yet another Zoom meeting. We appreciate it. This forum is designed to bring together insights from multiple disciplines and from diverse professional fields to discuss primarily three very big questions. One, what are the current impacts of the pandemic on youth? Two, what are the foreseeable long-term impacts of this crisis on this population? And three, what practice and policy innovations have emerged out of the situation that might lend themselves to sustainable efforts moving forward? Our approach to these questions is overlaid by an equity lens. Throughout our discussions, we've sought to focus on the pandemic's disparate impacts on historically marginalized populations, including youth of color, youth with behavioral health needs, LGBTQI youth, youth with disabilities, and immigrant youth. Since Tuesday, as Avery aptly summarized for us, we've benefited from the insight of phenomenal experts as they guided us through answering these questions in three vital environments: homes, communities, and justice systems. This morning, we shifted to education. And now we pivot to out-of-home settings. When we chose the title of our forum, Are the Kids All Right? COVID-19 and Youth, we knew that the cultural reference was, a bit of a misnomer. Our understanding of youth includes, of course, kids and teens, but also emerging adults. Those of you who were with us yesterday for our Justice Systems 2 panel in the afternoon heard Josh Rovner from the Sentencing Project, as well as other wonderful panelists, speak about issues facing children and teens held in detention. I want to call your attention to the video of that session, which is available in full in our Facebook page in case you missed it. Today, we intentionally want to draw your attention to the latter age group, the emerging adults. Thus, when discussion issues that emerged in custodial settings and placement as a result of this pandemic, we will seek to seize on the expertise of our panelists, which includes a wealth of knowledge of the impact of COVID-19 on jails. But we also want to expand this conversation to discuss the impacts on youth in other out-of-home settings. We're fortunate to have participating in this panel right now, Dr. Chris Wildermann, who will share thoughts on the impact on youth in congregate care settings, including foster care settings. We are absolutely honored to have a stellar roster of experts continue to lead these discussions this afternoon and tomorrow to help us get closer to the answers that will guide our collective work moving forward. I want to take a moment and express my sincere thanks to the panelists, to the moderators, and to our plenary and keynote speakers, Michael and Pierre and Professor John Powell, who will be joining us tomorrow. If you haven't signed up for that session, I encourage you to do so, as well as to the session on research and funding in the afternoon, or starting at 11:30 rather. My thanks also to the staff and the scholars of the YJI, and especially to Alicia Gagnon, Avery Irons, and Brian Rainey. Behind the scenes, you can't see, but we have an army of incredible college students make sure everything is running smoothly. Samaria Alpern, whom you just met, Sasha Baroda, Paul White, Justine Disio, and Jiwon Ryu. Without them, this could not happen. So thank you so much for your hard work. The YJI results from a partnership between the New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, and SUNY Albany. I'd like to extend my thanks to the YJI's Executive Board and to the New York State Juvenile Justice Advisory Group for their incredible and unwavering support for the Institute. And my thanks also to SUNY distinguished professors and former deans of the School of Criminal Justice, Bill Pridemore and Alan Lizotte, to Professor Megan Kurlichek at Penn State, and to the staff of the Division for Research at SUNY. I also would like to thank Diane Sierpino from the Tau Foundation for all her help. All right, I have a very tough job now, so I'm going to start with a thank you and an apology. Thanks to our panelists and our moderator, and my apology in advance because there's just no way I can do justice to your experience and your credentials in the very short amount of time that's been allocated to me to introduce you. So without further ado, we would like to welcome Chris Wildermann, who is the Associate Vice Provost for the Social Sciences, Director of the Bronfenbrenner Center for Translational Research, and Director of the National Data Archive on Child Abuse and Neglect at Cornell University. There, he is also a professor of policy analysis and management, and holds an appointment by courtesy in the sociology department. Since 2015, Chris has also been a senior researcher at the Rockwool Foundation Research Unit in Copenhagen, in Denmark. His research and teaching interests revolve around the consequences of mass imprisonment for inequality, with emphasis on families, health, and children. He is also interested in child welfare, especially as it relates to child maltreatment and the foster care system. He is the 2013 recipient of the Ruth Caven Young Scholar Award from the American Society of Criminology. Welcome to the panel, Chris. Also here today and webcasting from Hawaii is Dan MISTAK, who is the Director of Healthcare Initiatives for Justice-Involved Populations at the Community-Oriented Correctional Health Services, or COACHES. Among his many accomplishments, Dan has worked with the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii to provide support to map Hawaii County's behavioral health safety net and its interface with the criminal justice system. While there, he was a trial attorney and worked with justice-involved individuals regarding the collateral consequences of their justice involvement. Prior to joining COACHES, Mr. MISTAK was a senior editor of the California Law Review at UC Berkeley School of Law. His previous experience has focused on legal issues for underprivileged populations, including representation of clients in asylum hearings, legal research surrounding the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and campaign finance. Welcome to the panel, Dan. It is my pleasure to also introduce to you Eddie Ellis. Eddie joined the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth as the Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network, or ICANN, coordinator in early 2018. In this role, Eddie works with ICANN members across the country, connecting them to each other and with local resources. He also works with other directly impacted communities, including the family members of juvenile lifers. Eddie, a native Washingtonian, was arrested and charged with murder at the age of 16. He was later found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 22 years in prison. He served 15 years and finished the rest of his time on parole. Eddie came home in 2006, and since that time, he has worked on a variety of issues, including reentry, solitary confinement, and on behalf of people with disabilities who are in the system and coming home. Eddie has served on the board of directors of a national legal organization and has helped with client-centered training for lawyers, probation officers, and social workers. He is an advocate for those in the system, a mentor, and a motivational speaker. His lived experience as a formerly incarcerated person provides invaluable insight and depth into his work that allows him to connect with and engage the community he serves. Welcome to the panel, Eddie. Here with us also is Mishi SOYER, who is an assistant professor in the sociology department at Hunter College, CUNY. Mishi is the author of 2 books, A Dream Denied Incarceration. Excuse me, just a minute. I'm so sorry. I'm losing my voice due to allergies. Apologies. Mishi is the author of 2 books, A Dream Denied and Lost Childhood's Poverty, Trauma, and Violent Crime in the Post-Welfare Era, both published with the University of California Press. She is currently working on a project that compares juvenile justice institutions in Germany and the United States. I personally can't wait to hear this cross-national perspective that may come through in your answers to the questions today, Mishi. So thank you for joining us and welcome. Now, to moderate all of these voices, we are pleased to introduce to you Dr. Corey WHICHARD, who is an assistant professor at the School of Criminal Justice at the University at Albany. Corey has broad research interests in life course criminology, social network analysis, incarceration, and prison reentry. His research has been published in such outlets as Criminology, Social Networks, the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, and the Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency. Coming next, Corey is drawing on his expertise in life course criminology to develop research questions concerning intergenerational continuity in substance abuse and delinquency, such as how parents' experiences during the transition to adulthood may interrupt or amplify their children's own problem behavior. It is a pleasure to bring you all into this conversation now, and I would like to pass the baton to Corey. Thank you.
Thanks, Giza. I'm very excited to serve as the moderator on today's panel. So I'll just provide a very brief overview of how this is going to unfold. So the panel has been organized as a conversation in 5 parts. We're going to discuss first the impact that COVID-19 has already had on justice-involved youth. Then we're going to talk about the likely future consequences of COVID-19. Following that, we're going to discuss what needs to be done to prepare and mitigate some of these consequences. Fourth, we're going to talk about emerging innovations in response to COVID-19. And in the 5th round, we're going to discuss remaining questions and implications for research and practice. And then we'll end the panel with a question and answer session from the virtual audience. So to start, I want to start by first discussing with the panelists the impact that COVID-19 has already had on justice-involved youth, their families, and service provision. And so to start the first round, I'm going to pose the same question to each panelist. It's a 2-part question. First, please provide a brief overview of the pre-COVID-19 state of your work and the populations you've served or studied. Second, now that we are months into the pandemic, what impacts on youth, families, and service provision are you seeing from your vantage point? So 2 questions. The first one is just briefly describe the pre-COVID-19 state of your work and then the impacts of COVID-19 that you've seen. And so I'm going to start by asking Eddie, if you could start us off with discussing the pre-COVID-19 state of your work and the impacts you've seen. And then I have a quick follow-up question once you're done discussing that.
Okay, thank you, Corey. Pre-COVID, we normally, in DC at the campaign, some of our staff normally go to court hearings for life sentence children to collect data, connect with family members, and make sure the family members connect with the resources that they need to help them out. And this is something that's been stopped because of COVID. Normally we hold a monthly group for the DC IRA former juvenile lifers in DC each month, face-to-face, and have them talk about their time in prison as children and up into adults, and now upon their release, and we try to provide them with all the resources that they need to help them out and connect them with different programs within DC and the Maryland area that can be supportive of them. And legislative work that some of the folks in the legal department of the campaign, some of us who have been impacted that help out with, we are not able to go to certain, state houses to do work, to, council members, senators and folks like that to try to, educate them on the impact of children being sentenced to life without parole in the United States. But also, this would have been our 3rd year anniversary of our self-care convening that we host for former life sentence children. And we bring 20 or so to different states that we host self-care convening to help them talk about the impact of their choice, the impact of incarceration, and how can we grow and heal as children who were formerly incarcerated in the system. And at this time, what we're doing, we're resorting to more of Zoom to try to, we're going twice a month with groups for our former life sentence children here in DC, and nationally at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth. We hold our national ICANN meeting, and we're doing more of self-care conversations along with support of a social worker to help us walk through and talk through the things that we are dealing with and we're working with, and try to also connect them to the resources that's there. But we have a lot of former life sentence children who are having problems with technical things, meaning computers, phones, and normally face-to-face we'll be able to help them out, but we're trying to do it over Zoom because of, trying to make sure we have that 6-foot space, as far as supporting people. But it's really hard to really do a lot of our work because we are on Zoom. We can't be there with people that we're supporting. And most of us are parents, so we're also not working. We're also trying to help with our children's schoolwork at this time. So it's a lot that COVID has stopped. But I think just trying to be creative in this time is very important to support the people that we are supporting.
Thanks, Eddie. Just a quick follow-up question for you specifically. So if we think about youth and emerging adults in jail, detention, or placement right now, how do you think they perceive the stakes with what's going on?
Well, personally, I heard from a young person that's being held in the youth detention center, and what he explained to me was he feel endangered. He's afraid. He also had a family member that passed away. He can't be there with his family member nor his mother. So I think a lot of people are dealing with fear, not knowing what's going to happen. They can't social distance because of the way the institutions are built. Some institutions have dormitory style sleeping areas where people are in one area, and you have institutions who have cellmates. People are together in cells with each other, so they can't social distance. Some people don't have masks to put on, to protect themselves. They have to tie shirts around their face to protect themselves. So a lot of young people are very frightened about what's going on. They feel forgotten about. The fear of being locked down and put in solitary type settings, which can be very damaging to people in general, but especially young people. When we talk about young people, brain is still maturing up at the age of 25. Now you have children who are in these situations are being emotionally affected by the COVID, environment at this time, and because of the way institutions are treating the young people, and not allowing them to social distance, and a lot of them are saying, why they're not letting us go home to detention, to be in our house with our family, where we will feel more safe and comfortable. And that's the fear that I've seen, But the thing I think is important that these institutions that's holding these young people need to make sure that it's social workers and people there to help these young people emotionally work through what's going on, and that I think can be helpful to some extent. But I think that it's very important at this time to make sure that they have social workers and those in that professional field to help them in this moment.
Thanks, Eddie. And if you just a quick note, a technical note, if you could maybe lean in for your mic to improve the audio a little bit, but thank you very much. And so I appreciate that. Okay. The next I want to ask Chris Wildermann the same question. So to start, Chris, what do you think? Could you briefly provide an overview of the pre-COVID-19 state of your work? That's the first part. And then the second part is, now that we're months into the pandemic, what are some of the impacts that you've seen?
Yeah, that's great. So Thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure. I'm so excited to hear what the other panelists have to say. One brief note is my 2 small children are already starting to make a ton of noise in the next room, so I just apologize in advance if at some point they're screaming in the background. So that being said, I mean, I'm a demographer by training, and so most of what I do is use big administrative data sets to estimate the prevalence, causes, and consequences of contact with the child welfare system and the criminal justice system for families. And so in that sense, my immediate work hasn't changed that much, with the exception of getting irritated that I don't yet have data I can put my hands on to try to get a sense of sort of what the demographic consequences of COVID are for marginalized youth and especially institutionalized youth. So that would be how I'd answer the first question, I think.
And a follow-up question for you specifically, Chris. Can you speak to the physical health concerns for foster youth and youth in non-detention placement settings?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Again, this is just going to be more conjecture than anything else, and based kind of just on what I think will be some of the core concerns around logistics. So I think the biggest issue that I think folks who are either in juvenile detention facilities or who are in sort of secure foster care settings is that getting switched out of a more repressive or more detrimental placement is going to be exceptionally difficult, I think, now. And I think that will even be more the case during sort of the second wave of the pandemic, which I know we're not supposed to talk about because we're supposed to be optimists. But I think, during the second wave of the pandemic, I think systems are going to be so overrun that switching youth out of really detrimental placements will become even more difficult. And so I think when we think about sort of physical and mental health, that would be something that I would worry about a bunch. I mean, the other 2 things that I'd worry about a bit are, first, that, there may just not be enough high quality placements to go around because folks are worried about COVID, or folks have a much worse financial situation now than they did, 3 to 6 months ago. So if there's less supply of high quality foster homes and folks who have their foster home available might still be nervous about taking in a youth who's been in an institution for a week because they'd be worried about COVID exposure, then I think that could be really problematic for getting youth who are new to the system, which we would expect there to be a lot of because of increases in maltreatment. I really worry about those settings. And then the other thing, and this is really mundane, but I think really important, is youth who are in the juvenile justice system and youth who are in the foster care system disproportionately have sort of a whole host of mental and physical health problems that need consistent treatment to be managed and under control. And I just think a lot of those basic kind of check-ins are likely to slip through the cracks because folks are overrun and there are a bunch of concerns about disease exposure. And so I would worry about whether youth will be able to sort of maintain an effective regimen for that. So that's all I have. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Michi, next. So I want to ask you the same question I asked the other 2 panelists. If you could start by describing sort of the pre-COVID-19 state of your work, and then since now that we're months into this, what sort of the impacts you're seeing as a result. And then I have a brief follow-up question.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be part of this panel. It's very excited to hear everybody talk about their perspective on COVID-19 and the impact it will have on youth. So the data collection that I finished last year was focused on juveniles who were held in Germany. And they were held in a juvenile prison. So I did work on juveniles that were already adjudicated and were serving their sentences. And prior to that, I did a study with juveniles adjudicated as adults in Pennsylvania. And so what I found in both places was, well, in Pennsylvania more than in Germany, that these kids actually didn't have a lot of visitors, right? So especially in Pennsylvania, these there were a few that had regular contact, but those families happened to live close to the prison, and so these youth basically were already extremely isolated, right? And they already were afraid of what was going on at home. And they, I can just imagine how much more difficult it will be now, knowing that the situation at home is even more uncertain than it already was. In Germany, you may have heard the news, that actually things are under control, more or less, with the COVID-19. So the youth in Germany who are in prison, interestingly, they have committed comparable crimes, but obviously their sentences are much more lenient, and there is a lot more transition from the prison to the outside. So these kids actually can go out and they go shopping. They're not allowed to get searched when they come back in. So it's a very sort of a much more open setting, even though it's a prison and it looks like a prison. So I think that for these kids, what has changed is that, the interaction with the outside world now is extremely limited, or has been limited. And also they are not able to have any visitors. But from what I heard from my contact person there, they have not actually had any issues within the prison, right? Because they assume that these youth are at low risk of COVID-19. And so they're basically just concerned about minimizing, exposure of parents or caregivers that could be potentially coming in. Oops.
Thanks, Michi. So just a quick follow-up question related to your work. So do you think we should expect different experiences with COVID for youth who have been transferred to the adult system versus youth in juvenile detention centers?
I think that, and I can only speak from my limited experience with one juvenile justice facility in Pennsylvania, where the youth were transferred. And then I did work in detention centers in Boston and Chicago. And I think that the youth who are held who are held in adult prison settings are much more isolated to begin with, right? Many have lost contact with their families, and they're really, they're already serving their time alone. Most of them do. But so I find it really difficult to predict how severe the actual impact is for those youth, because they're very extreme cases, right? Many actually haven't spoken to their families in years. So I think that psychologically it will be difficult for them to worry about what's going on the outside, but I think in terms of contact, right, this situation may have not altered much for them, for at least some of them. My experience in detention centers obviously is that they're much more, the turnover is a lot higher, right? And they're close to home, so parents can visit. And so there's also, it's a much more transitionary situation. And so I think for those kids, and also oftentimes these kids are younger, right? They may be held there for minor crimes. And so they are not as used to, being institutionalized. And so I could imagine that for those kids, COVID-19 has a much more severe impact because their contact to the outside world is now ruptured.
Thanks, Mishi. So Dan, I want to ask the same kind of introductory question for you as well. Can you describe the pre-COVID-19 state of your work, as well as the impact that you've seen now that we're a few months into this?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm from Coaches, Community-Oriented Correctional Health Services. We're a nonprofit. We started back in 2005. And our goal was to be able to demonstrate that the health concerns of folks in the community are the same as the health concerns behind the walls of the jail, and that the jail really erects an artificial barrier that allows us to forget about those behind the walls of the jail and disconnect them from the broader community and the supports and the health systems that have built up to support people who are in need. So what we've always tried to do is to try and bring in community standards of care, community providers inside the jail in order to try and dissolve this artificial barrier between the inside and outside. And one of the things that we always talked about is that the fact that jails are incubators for infectious disease. And I should say for a moment that we work mostly on the adult side of things, always interested in carrying the banner for youths as well and doing work on that stuff. But just because of the history of Coaches, we've focused on adults more. Unfortunately, a lot of youth end up inside the adult system. So I think that's probably why I was invited here. So we've always said public health and public safety are intimately intertwined, and COVID-19 has put an exclamation mark on the back end of that. COVID-19, I think, has exposed the things, is forcing people to face the things that a lot of us who work in this space know, is that our systems do not often care about Black and brown lives, that they are not built to support them. They're built to punish often. They are built to further alienate. And because of that, we have bad health outcomes. We have people who aren't able to get the care that they need as they're leaving jail. We have reentry services because of the way Medicaid itself is structured that doesn't allow for reach-in, that doesn't allow for people to be able to connect with community providers. And in the same way, that leaves folks who are providing reentry support at the mercy of state and local grant making. They can't connect in with broader Medicaid systems just because of the important things that they have to do are by law not allowed to be reimbursed through the Medicaid system, which funds the vast majority of folks who are involved with the criminal justice system. So I think what COVID has done is it's forcing everyone to pay attention to this a little bit more. But I also think what it's doing, COVID is also shining a light on this work in a different way, which is what we're seeing right now out in the streets and what's happening out there, where people are saying that this is something that we have ignored, that we have not listened to. And and when I was asked to do this, it was long before the protests started happening. And so I just want to make sure that we're very aware of that as well here on the panel, that there are voices right now that should be elevated that aren't mine, people who have lived this experience a lot more. I'm just a nerd who knows Medicaid stuff and cares about the folks that I'm trying to serve. And so I'm just here in that nerd role, and I would love the opportunity to elevate the voices that should be, that also should be being heard right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And so, unless any of the panelists want to respond to one another, that with what was just discussed, we so notify me if you want to do that. But we can also move on to this. So that was sort of the first round where we just discussed everyone's pre-COVID, the state of their work pre-COVID, and then some of the impacts they've seen. The second round, so to start the second round, we just discussed impacts that the panelists have already observed. And so the focus of the second round is likely future consequences. So this is stuff that maybe has not happened yet or hasn't fully started to happen yet, but is likely to happen in the future or in the near future. And so I'm going to actually, I ended the last round with Dan. I'm going to start this round with Dan. And so Dan, if you would start the round. So as states begin to reopen, what are some of the current thoughts regarding youth and staff well-being in correctional facilities?
Great. Good question. Just as like a level setting, I think it is important, and Chris, you like touched on this and said we need to be optimistic, and optimism is always welcome. But I think it's important to say that there's wide divergence between what scientists are saying and what we're actually doing with our government. We are actually, like the World Health Organization was very clear, we aren't even through the first wave yet, and we're reopening from an epidemiological point of view. So, you know, the idea of reopening is definitely premature. Now, on the other hand, there's a reopening in a different way of being able to interrogate and ask ourselves, really, what is our juvenile justice system doing? What is our criminal justice system doing? And I think that reopening is something that we should be really clear about and be paying attention to on how we have constructed these systems. I also want to point out that apparently Governor Cuomo has announced that New York State is to observe a moment of silence at 2 p.m. Just as a heads up, to all of us who are here today too. I think my opinion is that it would be edifying at the least to take a moment to think of that voice that was silenced. So something we've seen on the adult side of things though is that there's been a wide range of responses to the COVID-19 and what they're trying to do when it comes to re-entry. It ends up being as many jurisdictions are looking to ways in which they can try and allow people to come out and to re-enter, looking for ways in which to let out nonviolent offenders. Other jurisdictions are responding more draconianly. They are trying to, they're using medical language in order to place people in isolation, which, as we know, is terrible for folks' mental health. We should be aware of the way in which medical language can often be used to wrap around things that we would normally not be supportive of. I'm sorry, I'm looking over here. I have a broken monitor, so all of my notes are on this one. And so one of the things that we always have to pay attention to is that these facilities genuinely and generally are opaque. They have their own health systems, they have their own data systems, and they don't like to release that information. And as COVID-19 was sweeping around the country or around the world, we were seeing, if you were following the numbers, and like I said, I'm a nerd in many ways. I was following and watching how different states, different countries were keeping the information and data coming out of them very tight to the chest, because they didn't want to be seen as a place that had an outbreak. They didn't want to be responding in ways that made anyone else panic or made them feel like they were uniquely hit by this crisis. And I think that it's not impossible that we could expect the historically opaque jail system to be doing similar things, because nobody wants to have an outbreak on their watch. And so I think that while a lot of jurisdictions are releasing data, though, it's always important to take things with a grain of salt and with an appropriate amount of suspicion in order to really pay attention to the fact that we could use this opportunity to have a little bit more understanding of what's going on for the health consequences of folks inside the jail. So one of the things I do want to point out is that we've talked about we're supposed to talk about the explicit patterns of inequalities, which are, of course, all the more present today than ever. And what's happening with COVID-19 is we are seeing compounding inequalities, the compounding inequalities of our health system, the compounding inequalities of our criminal justice system, and that these health disparities exist because of historical inequality, ways in which populations have been policed, and they're even more exacerbated at this moment. When I wrote these notes up, this was again before the protests, so they're being even further exacerbated now. And I think that unless we begin to really question the fundamentals of incarceration, the goals of what we're doing in the country, I don't see how we aren't going to continue to exacerbate the inequalities that exist. So we have to be aware of the fact that these systems rose up in a racialized and unequal world, and that we have to be very thoughtful about how we're trying to solve this situation in a way that doesn't end up being equally racialized and have a disparate impact on those we're serving as well.
Thanks, Dan. And I just wanted to note that at 2 p.m., Avery is going to be rejoining the video feed, and we will observe the moment of silence at 2 p.m. so that y'all can expect that to happen at 2 p.m. So thank you, Dan, for your response. Next, so again, this round's about future consequences, things that maybe haven't happened yet as a result of COVID, but that are likely to happen. And so the next question I wanted to pose is for Michi. So Michi, you've published 2 books related to the experiences of men who were incarcerated as youth. And so in addition to speaking generally about your thoughts on some of the likely future consequences of COVID, a more specific question that you might also consider addressing when I'm done talking is what are your thoughts on the trauma and mental health supports needed for youth and emerging adults who are incarcerated right now?
So, I mean, I think, and you know, Dan, I agree with what Dan said previously, that one of the big problems is that like the world that these kids will come out to if they are detained will be even more hostile than what it was before, right? So all the problems that these youth had with education, finding a job, finding a way to be in this world in a meaningful fashion will be exacerbated, and so I worry about the utter lack of, the state budgets will be cut. At CUNY we are already sitting here very scared of what will happen to us, and obviously this goes for all the services that are offered. And there wasn't a lot there to begin with. And I as a, not non-American, I always find it fascinating that the first, it feels like that nobody actually thinks about increasing social services, but now that we have to cut the budgets, we are cutting, more social services at the time of need, while obviously in Germany it's the exact opposite reaction. There's a lot more money being spent. So I think that actually the German youth that I interviewed, for them, not a lot will change, because Germany has a much more robust system of, of welfare, and people didn't actually lose their jobs. There's a system that lets people continue to be officially employed, and the government is supplementing their income. And so I think that Germany will have a much easier time recovering from this, while the low wage sector in the United States will have an extremely hard time. And all the youth that I talked to in Chicago and Boston, they were if they were lucky, right, if they managed to get out of the system, the best they could hope for was working in the low wage sector, right? And doing, working in food services, and, that in itself is obviously a problem, but it seems like now those jobs will be gone. And, the same goes for their parents. And we see here, today I was actually up in my co-op in the Bronx, and they told me that they're now collecting food. They're collecting food, and they're giving it out to residents in my complex, in my building complex, which is mostly minorities and lower middle class people, and it has hit everyone really hard. So these communities that were barely making it and barely getting by, they're now destroyed. And I don't even want to imagine what, to a certain extent, right now these kids have food, they have shelter, they have, it's not great, but when they're out, I don't know if that will actually be there for them. And in terms of the mental health, of course, I think, as I said before, the stress, being in New York was extremely stressful during this time. And, I am in a very privileged position, right? I don't have to go out and, you know, I'm not an essential worker in that sense, but obviously, you know, if these children are incarcerated, they're separated from their family, like they need the mental health support, and they need someone to facilitate contact, right? Like interaction with their parents or caregivers, that, you know, maybe by Zoom, and I don't know to what extent that's actually happening in facilities. But obviously that's extremely stressful, and even though this population itself is not likely to be extremely affected, I mean that many of these kids are raised by grandparents, right? Like they're not actually, the mothers are not in the picture, fathers are not in the picture, so like their caregivers are people that are old and are in a high risk category, and I think that's something that we need to think about as well, that the impact on them is indirect, because the people that would usually be there for them when they get out, you know, they may have been very sick or may have died.
Thanks, Mishi. And so now I want to ask a similar question to Eddie. So again, this round is about likely future consequences related to COVID. So stuff that maybe hasn't happened yet or fully emerged, but that you're seeing, you think is very likely to happen in the near future. And so that's sort of the big picture question for this round. But for you specifically, you've spoken in the past about not realizing the impact of your incarceration had on your mother until you were much older. And so as we think about youth and families separated right now, what do systems and community stakeholders need to do as youth and families navigate loss of in-person visits, physical contact, and grieve the loss of loved ones?
Yeah, thank you, Corey. I think for me, I lost my dad when I was a child, and my mother raised me, my grandmother raised me. And coming to jail as a 16-year-old child, facing life in jail because of my actions as a child, I just felt really torn away from my mother. I wasn't able to have my mother. I needed my mother. And to think about these children now, you know, Black kids, brown kids, and, you know, kids of color, when I think about them now, it's a little worse, because you think about the COVID crisis that's separating and keeping people apart and taking away programs and lack of communication, but also think about the state of America now, where we are now with these people out in the street, you know, showing their right and voicing their voice on what's taking place. You know, so you look at Black kids and brown kids now looking at what's happening in the world, emotionally, they're torn because of what's taking place in this world and what's been happening for generations. So that's one thing I think we need to pay attention to, that some of these kids are hurting, not because of COVID, but because they are being held in the system, but because of what's taking place in this world. The way Black and brown kids are being treated in this world, they need to be treated. They looking at people being brutalized that look just like them. So emotionally, it's a lot of things going on. And I want to talk about resilience. I think resilience can be used in a way that can be detrimental at times also, because I was a resilient child when I went to jail at 16. But that's not to say that I wasn't torn because of being in prison for 15 years and serving 10 years in solitary confinement. So we can be resilient, but let's not mistake at all that we are not hurt by the things that we go through. And I think sometimes resilience can be used in a way to mismanage the trauma and the punishment that these children are going through. You know, so I think we have to these kids communicate with their family. If it's Zoom, more phone calls, you know, more free paper, free stamp for these kids to do this. And I don't know if it's happening or not, so I don't want to throw that out there like that. But I just think we need to make sure that we have these kids in position to talk to someone in the community that they love and trust. And we need more, and I'm going to keep emphasizing this, people in place to help these kids deal with emotional trauma at this time. Because this is a lot of stuff that these children are going through. We as adults are being hit hard by these times right now. So kids are receiving it more. You know, and I think we have to put things in place to continue to help our kids emotionally grow and help them in this moment. You know, not just take their anger as being anger, but the anger is a response to what's taking place in this world. We need to try to help them, you know, direct their anger in a more healthy space in place. You know, but us as adults have to start taking on some of this stuff too. And the government and the system need to understand that there have been a problem and a part of some of these things that's taking place.
Thanks, Eddie. I want to end the round by asking Chris the same question. So again, the kind of the broad big picture question organizing this round is some of the likely future consequences related to COVID. For you specifically, though, following the vein of this round of questions, can you widen our lens to discuss other populations of youth and emerging adults in out-of-home care, such as foster youth and congregate care?
Sure, happy to. And I am going to be quick because I want to make sure I'm done before the moment of silence. So I just want to say four things. Sorry, my children are screaming in the background. The second thing is, Eddie's point about resilience is really, really important. And I just wanted to strongly agree with that, because I do think we often talk about resilience in ways that make the conditions folks are exposed to seem okay or justifiable in some ways. And I just think Eddie's point is really great. The third thing I want to say is the biggest thing that I think we need to have an eye out for right now is massive increases in shelter utilization as a result of housing displacements that will come from the economic fallout from COVID-19. And I think thinking about the implications of crowded shelters for youth where there's a ton of coming and going inside of the institution, and where there are folks who have no real way to keep themselves safe and potentially need to make money however they can, strikes me as just an incredibly important thing that I haven't heard folks talking about, I think, in the way that they should be. I think we're just going to have a huge increase in the unstably housed population, especially for youth. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think it's been a while of not having good check-ins with teachers for foster youth. Which is a really, really important point for having a sense of how those youth are doing. But at this point, it hasn't been a gap that's any longer than what most youth experience in the summer. And so I think we have a good sense of how to keep track of youth during sort of a 2.5 to 3 month period of time. But if there's a very real possibility that it could be a 9-month period of time or a 12-month period of time, where youth aren't in school, where they're not engaging with teachers, and where there's not this other additional source of monitoring about the quality of the placement and the quality of the development, that just strikes me as really deeply problematic for these marginalized populations. So those are the things I'd say, and it's 1:59 now.
So, hi everyone, thank you. So we're going to observe the moment of silence, just so folks know that this is actually happening simultaneous with the start of the memorial for George Floyd in Minneapolis right now. So thank you so much for holding space with us, his family, his community, and communities, our global community, who are feeling the hurt and pain of this moment. So thank you. We'll take a moment for Mr. Floyd. Thank you, everyone. We can resume the conversation now. I'll turn it back over to you, Corey.
Thank you, Avery. And so to kind of reconnect with what we were, with the discussion that was going on. So the first round was about consequences of COVID that the panelists had already observed. The second round was about likely consequences in the future. And so having just discussed some of the consequences and potential consequences, this round, the third round, is focused on what needs to be done to prepare for and mitigate some of these consequences. And so I'd like to start with Dan. Dan, so from a public health perspective, what are the health considerations that facilities need to be mindful of as youth and young adults return home?
So the health things that we need to be aware of is that, obviously the sorts of things is understanding an individual status, understanding where they're being released to, a lot of health education about how things work, how the virus spreads. I think those things are really important from a health point of view. Sorry, my screen keeps going full screen, so I can't see myself. That's okay. Some of the health things that I do want to point out too is that our health system broadly is funded for folks who are justice involved through Medicaid or CHIP programs. And because the Social Security Act actually bars the use of Medicaid, paying for Medicaid benefits for individuals once they're inmates of a public institution, that means that folks who are in juvenile detention, but also in a jail, are ineligible to receive Medicaid benefits, even if they are Medicaid or CHIP eligible. So that's like a really nerdy problem, but what that means is that we've created a system with incredible discontinuities of care, so that an individual who might be receiving care in the community, once they're inside the facility, can't actually continue that same care, and then once they're released back into the community, there's not a lot of connection from the juvenile facility or the jail into the broader health system in order to help people be able to meet their needs and understand what they need to do next in order to keep themselves and their families safe. And what this has done is this has created a reentry service. I just want to follow up on what Michi said in the last round. It's created a system where reentry services tend to be grant funded, and we're going to see an incredible loss. We're already seeing an incredible loss of revenue for state and local jurisdictions. And the consequence of this is going to be that in Hawaii, what we're already seeing is a lot of community-based organizations that try and provide reentry services aren't getting their grants and aid that they have been already awarded by the county or by the state. And that's really at this time when reentry is such an important part of what we need to be funding. It means that we aren't able to actually have that continuous system of care and to fund those reentry services. Also want to touch on what is reopening going to do to have an impact on this problem already, this discontinuous system of care. And I think what reopening is going to do is it's again going to compound these problems. We've reopened we're reopening the economy at this point, and what we're going to see is that the virus has never been under control. And that we're going to be taxing our health system on the other side of this, that we're going to be facing, once again, the situation that we were in back in March, which is where a lot of people are getting sick, and a lot of the negative consequences are going to be flowing to communities that are already hurting and are already in pain. And so from a public health point of view, I am I'm pretty cynical. I'm pretty worried about what comes next. But I do think that there are some opportunities for optimism, which is what we've seen is that this is the greatest decarceration that I think has ever happened inside of our correctional systems. And what we're seeing is that the rate of recidivism is incredibly low. So here in Hawaii, they actually have not done a great job of releasing folks just because our community spread has been pretty low. But they've seen that the people that they have released, it's been about a 6% recidivism rate. And that recidivism is actually based on not calling and not checking in, all the sort of like probation things that people get dragged back into jail for. And that's a huge, that should be something that we are like putting on the front page of everything. So we've effectively shown that decarceration doesn't necessarily lead to recidivism. So this is something that I hope that we'll continue to remember as we go forward in this, because I think that we really are getting a better picture that we need to invest in reentry services better, and that we can really rely on decarceration to mitigate a lot of the problems that we're seeing.
Thanks, Dan. So I want to, again, in the same vein of this round, thinking about how we can prepare for and mitigate consequences associated with COVID. This next question, it's the same question for both Eddie and Mishi. And so I'll state the question, and then Eddie, I'd like for you to share your perspective first. And so here is the question. So youth and young adults are re-entering a world that has been radically altered by the pandemic, and they will likely be returning to circumstances with new family dynamics, potentially strained financial resources, fewer job opportunities, and a shift to online education. So what needs to be done to support people as they return home in this context? Eddie.
Well, thanks, Corey. For me, I think we have to put in place, if we can, more programs that can train people and bring them up to date with technology. But funding is very important. Creative funding is very important. I just think that because of this pandemic and what has happened, a lot of nonprofits and programs may fold because of the strain of this, that didn't have the financial support and backing. And I just think we need to put things in place to support the organizations and entities that's supporting these individuals who are coming home from these facilities and detention centers. We have to give creative. For example, my organization, the group we hold in DC twice a month, we make sure we give them gift cards, each group, to help them out, because most of them are not working at this time. And the ones who just came home that got jobs were automatically fired when they was asked for ID, because they only had institution ID, and then they moved to a paper ID, and the job fired some of them again. So that's been very hard for a lot of them now, trying to come home and find jobs in this time. I just think, again, we have to be creative in these moments and understand that a lot of things will not be the same, but programs, more funding, creative funding, more training and support programs. But also, I think we need to fund, again, and I'm going to keep saying it, emotional support organizations that's giving people emotional support. Because coming out of this, what happens, I don't know. But I know that a lot of people emotionally will be drained. And we need to make sure that we are supporting people, and even supporting the people who are giving us the emotional support. They need support. So I just think we need a lot of things to happen. But for me, what's important is the overall emotional support of people to help them hold on through this time, but also creative funding and funding different programs.
Thanks, Eddie. So Mishi, same question. I'm not going to repeat the whole thing, but just to as a refresher. So people are getting out, and the world's different now, and almost certainly going to be more difficult in a lot of ways. So what do you think needs to be done to support people as they return home in this context? And what are your thoughts about that?
I think that what we are seeing in New York is that there's a huge discrepancy in terms of access to electronics, right? So we are now. It's pretty clear that even though, at CUNY, for example, we had to, our students, were not able to actively transition to online learning because they didn't have access to computers, right? And they were begging administrators to go back to campus so that they could access electronics, right? They were asking for going to campus to take their online classes. So obviously, the situation of kids who return home is even worse than the situation that our students are in. I think that as a state and as a society, I think the United States needs to reckon with the extreme inequality. And I just want to briefly add, just because people don't recidivate doesn't mean they are okay. Right, like in my studies, actually in Chicago, kids recidivated all the time, and they weren't checked up on and they basically fell through the cracks, right? Like they didn't show up in an official statistics. And I think that's what I'm worried about, right? That like now nobody's checking, nobody's looking, not even the PO is looking, and people really will fall through the cracks. And I think that this moment would provide an opportunity to be like, okay, we are all, terribly shocked about what happened in Minnesota. And we're people who are out on the streets, but I also find it incredibly frustrating, because I think that what really needs to happen is a structural change, and that goes beyond just de-incarceration, but really focusing on redistribution and allowing these kids to have the life chances that middle-class children or upper middle-class children have. And I think that, an enormous amount of money needs to be put into that. But like, it seems like we're going into the opposite direction. And so it's not just about not being just as involved, but, like ironically, a lot of these kids use the juvenile justice system to get access to social services. A lot of kids, for the first time, talk to a mental health professional in the juvenile justice system, right? So like if we de-incarcerate, if we let these kids out, like we need to have things in place that actually catch them, right? And so that they don't fall through the cracks when they come out, and, emotionally and, and as Chris said, in terms of housing, right? I mean, at one point, evictions will start again, and then what happens, right? I think that we are actually at the beginning of a really dramatic crisis, and the solidarity, I think, needs to go beyond just being on the street and demonstrating against police brutality, but redistribution of resources.
Thanks, Mishi. So I'm going to pose a similar question to Chris now. And so again, with the focus of this round being the idea, what can we do to prepare for some of the eventual consequences of COVID, or the pre-existing consequences? In particular, you've studied the impact of mass incarceration on inequality. So from a macro perspective, how might we avoid exacerbating the disparate treatment and outcomes for marginalized groups?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I should say, having moderated many times, I'm super sensitive to when we're running behind. So I'm going to be as quick as possible. I think there are three kind of big ways that we can think about interventions for marginalized youth, and especially that could decrease youth inequalities. The first is like large kind of structural changes that have nothing directly to do with the criminal justice system or the child welfare system, right? So those would be things like healthcare access and quality of educational programming, and all these sorts of things that we all think of. Broader, like more universal, stronger programs are the best way to decrease inequality, especially inequality among youth. And so I think in a I was going to say in a perfect world, but even in a just less crappy world, that would be the lever you'd really want to pull. I mean, I think the thing that's tricky is that many of the programs that have been shown to be most cost effective and that also help diminish inequalities the most are really expensive. And the idea of rolling out more expensive programming during a time of a pretty massively shrinking tax base, I just think is going to be logistically difficult. And so in that sense, I think the best lever for decreasing inequalities is in some ways not available to us at this point. The second lever is the lever that basically helps us keep youth out of unnecessary foster care placements and unnecessary juvenile justice placements. And so that's a lever that we can use even during this crisis. And so I think the thing that I would really encourage folks to think about, and I think this is something that we should all be trying to intervene on at the more local level, is to say, is there any way that we could not place this kid either in a juvenile justice sort of situation or in a foster care setting? And if the answer is yes, what supports do we need to make available to make that happen? I actually think that provided you're coupling those supports, those targeted sort of supports, with decreases in entry into those settings, could actually do a lot in terms of decreasing inequality. Not as much as these broader sort of interventions, but still quite a bit. And then the third lever, and again, this is available to us during the pandemic, is to just improve conditions of confinement however we can, right? I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons, some of which I've mentioned, some of which the other panelists have mentioned, to be worried about conditions of confinement or placement conditions deteriorating during the pandemic. But I actually think that there are also reasons to think that you could use this as a way to shrink the population and invest more heavily in the youth who do need to be in those settings for whatever reason. And so I actually think, even though this first kind of lever is unavailable to us or is less available to us than it usually is, if we can manipulate the second and third lever simultaneously, I think there actually are ways in which we can help marginalized youth and decrease inequality between youth as a result.
Thanks, Chris. So in the interest, as Chris noted, in the interest of recouping some time to make sure everything unfolds on time, this next round, I originally was going to pose this question to all four panelists, but it is, as you'll hear when I say it, the question is more oriented towards practitioners, and so I'm going to just ask Dan and Eddie to answer this one, and I'm going to pose the question first for Dan. So just two of our four panelists will address this question. So the fourth round question is about emerging innovations in response to COVID-19. And so what stakeholder innovations are developing in your community, among your partners and in your fields, and what impacts are you seeing or expecting to see? And so Dan, if you could address that first.
Yeah, great. And I'm not allowed to share my video because it says the host stuff. Oh, there we go. Now it's happening. All right. So I think there's three things I want to highlight that are happening. And again, I'm up at the like 10,000 foot level or 30,000. But you know, the thing that I have been describing about the discontinuities of care and sort of the artifact of the Social Security Act as it was written, which creates and fuels a discontinuous system. I want to point out that inside the HEROES Act that Paul Tonko from New York has put forward and has been championing a bipartisan bill that would allow for Medicaid to pay for services 30 days before release. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't include CHIP recipients. It's just Medicaid, which a lot is moving. Most healthcare is moving over into Medicaid anyways. So that has passed inside the HEROES Act. Right now, it hasn't been something that's been in the Senate before. So COACH is trying to raise awareness around this because not only would it help alleviate the local budgets by allowing Medicaid to pay for services, but what it would also do is it would allow like re-entry services on the outside to start planning for what it would look like to have a lot more secure funding over a longer period of time. And I really believe that new systems would develop around that. One of the really good things about it, the HEROES Act, as it was scored, the Re-Entry Act component of it scored very low, so it's not that expensive. So I think that it would be something really appealing to anyone out there who lives in a state with a Republican senator. Happy to share some talking points with you about that. You can always feel free to reach out to me. So that's one of the big ones, the Re-Entry Act. The other one, Vera is trying to create reporting requirements. Like I said at the beginning, we have a real problem with the opacity of these correctional facilities. Understandably, it's hard to just kind of promulgate data and put it out there if there isn't a system for it. So Vera is trying to request that facilities do have to provide data to the CDC in order to keep track of what's going on. That's something that COACHES supports and we think makes a lot of sense and maps along the reporting requirements for hospitals as they're trying to keep track of what's going on with COVID too. I think it would be really useful. And finally, one of the things coaches is also trying to do is create a role for a correctional health coordinator. Now, what this correctional health coordinator would do would be somebody who is in each state, is tasked with being able to do the data collection. So, it's sort of complementary to what Vera is working on. But what this correctional health coordinator would do would be to collect data, but also would be able to overcome one of the shortcomings that we're seeing in jurisdictions across the country, which is states are all fighting with one another in order to get PPE and to be able to help create complementary approaches to reentry or reopening. So what this correctional health coordinator would do would be, it would stop local jurisdictions from fighting with one another to buy and purchase the PPE that's necessary to make sure that we're protecting folks who are on correctional staff and also people who are in corrections. So those are 3 of the innovations that we're seeing right now, and just wanted to share those with you.
Thanks, Dan. So Eddie, same question. I'm not going to reiterate the whole thing, but just briefly, the gist of the question is emerging innovations that you're seeing in response to COVID-19. And so, what are some of the innovations that you're currently seeing or that you're expecting to see?
What I'm seeing now is more organizations communicating more. Before this, you may have had some organizations that didn't communicate, that could fall in line with each other with supporting the people that they support. And that's been one of the most important things that I've been seeing, most innovative thing, to force, they're being forced to communicate with each other because we can't get out. So organizations have to really communicate with each other to try to get people support. And that's what we've been trying to do. And what we've been trying to do is the former juvenile lifers that work with us in different states. We have a program called Regional Connectors, where we work with former juvenile lifers and we have them to connect the folks in their area to the resources that they're familiar with to make sure that they're getting some support. So what we're trying to do, and we do the same thing with the family members that's a part of our national family calls each month, where we get them involved in helping us understand where the resources are, who need the resources. We send out, surveys to find out people in our population who need the resources, what resources they need. And that's one of the ways that we've been trying to be innovative, to step up that way, and not try to assume what people need, but send out the survey and ask our population of people what they need and see what we can do to help them. And we've been doing that. I mean, we have donated some Chrome pads to some people who will come home, shared ride credits for folks who are still working and people who need to go to hospital. And we also have been providing support to them with the social worker that come online with us. And for the women that's in our ICANN family, we also have a heart-to-heart group for them where they're doing journaling and doing things to help just grow with each other. So I think it's just being innovative with people working with each other. That's what I've been seeing. That's been working more because we are forced to reach out now and be more, to communicate more, to find out where the resources are. So that's what we've been doing. That's what I've been seeing.
Thanks, Eddie. And so thanks, Chris and Michi, for letting us hop over you for that round. That put us back in the right time frame for the broader panel. And so this is the last round, is round number 5 before the Q&A session. And so to close out the panel, and then we'll have the Q&A session. For this final round, I'm going to pose the same question for each of you, which is, from your vantage point, what are the remaining questions and implications for research and practice? And so Michi, if you could start us off for this round.
So as you know, Corey, I have tried, we're in the process of actually getting a project started that's not focused on youth, but we're trying to interview formerly incarcerated people that were struggling with drug addiction, and doing it through the phone. So I think that we should basically get data on these populations that nobody talks about right now. For prisoners being or formerly incarcerated people are not on the agenda right now. And I think that we need to try to get this data and go out there, collect it, and even if we can't do it, and for qualitative researchers, it's a problem that we can't do it face to face, but maybe make, again, for qualitative researchers, some compromises on the data quality, but just get the data and get it in as soon as possible to capture what people are going through. Because I think what Chris and I are both dealing with right now is that we don't have the data right now. And for qualitative researchers, it's also incredibly frustrating because you're not allowed to collect any face-to-face data and to go out there. And so I think that we really need to try to speak to people to figure out what they actually need and what they're experiencing, and to what, because often, I mean, at least for me, I don't know, I sometimes have very wrong conceptions about what people need, right? And then only if we talk to them will we actually find out, okay, this is what we need, this is what would actually help, right? And a lot of things that we concoct in thinking about what would be good support theoretically, may not trickle down effectively. So I think that doing work with these populations, with people, with youth who have been released, youth who are in foster care, using quantitative and qualitative data, and doing maybe even data collection through Zoom, right? Being allowed to do that. And I'm sure that has some terrible implications for IRB and privacy and whatever, but just in a world where there's no IRB, being able to do that, I think would be really great to not just speculate, but to actually be able to collect the data.
Thanks, Michi. So Chris, I'd like to pose a similar question to you, right? So from your vantage point, what are the remaining questions and implications for research and practice that you see?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I'd gotten to go before Michi because I was going to say a bunch of the same things. So, I think the biggest thing that we have to be aware of as researchers is that COVID is very much in our face right now, but there are a whole host of other issues that affect these youth before, during, and after their criminal justice and child welfare placements that we have to stay focused on, or there'll be really dramatic implications for those same youth. And so I think, so I'll use an example. For the adult prison system, just as one way to think about this. So, I mean, I think the quickest way to safely and rapidly decrease the imprisonment rate in the US is to have significantly shorter sentences for folks who are convicted of violent offenses. And that's an area where there's some research where we need a great deal more research. But if that topic gets completely lost, while we're so focused on sort of COVID-related things, then that's going to be really detrimental for the broader goal of decreasing the US imprisonment rate pretty significantly. And I think there are parallel sorts of issues with youth who are in juvenile detention, and then also with youth who are in secure foster care settings. So I think the key thing for researchers is going to be not losing focus of the fact that this is a very important thing right now and has really important implications and may very well for years and years to come. But there are other issues that are sort of timeless problems for these marginalized youth that we can't ignore because of what's immediately in front of our face.
Thanks, Chris. So now I'd like to turn to Dan. So same question, Dan. From your vantage point, what are the remaining questions and implications for research and practice?
I think the implications for what we've got coming down is to be able to, when we're trying to address things around the justice system, that we have to take the lead of COVID-19 and really approach the world as it is, which is one that is deeply interconnected with the economic outcomes for individuals, the racialized ways in which the world has been constructed around us, and that we address the health needs of individuals and how all of these things all compound on one another. We're always looking for really clean hypotheses inside of ideal test subjects when we're trying to do social science or hard science research, and so I think that we need to move beyond at this point in time. I think acting as though we're standing outside of the world and studying it, and much more understanding that the silos that we've created do a lot more to protect us as researchers and as the practitioners in the ways that we often are and that we have to throw those things off, and we have to be really willing to step into the weeds and do the work in order to try and reconstruct this system that has been broken from its inception. So I just think it's it's a call to action. It's a call to be honest with ourselves about how the world actually is. And I think that we have to face the ways in which the system has been constructed and it's operating exactly how it's supposed to. So mine is just what I think our call is to one of like radical and brutal honesty that demands that we are doing our part in order to try and fix things.
Thanks, Dan. Eddie, I'm going to give you the final word before we move to the Q&A session. And so just repeating the same question. So from your vantage point, Eddie, what are the remaining questions and implications for research and practice?
Well, I think for me right now is seeing the real health effect and the effect that COVID has had on a lot of people that's still in prison. I just think this is a scare of what things can look like if things get even worse in the future for those who are being held inside of facilities and can't social distance, and institutions and prisons are not being equipped to really handle these type of situations. So I think for me, that's something that's very important, because when people come home, in these situations, again, people spoke about lack of housing, is research being done around housing, people not being able to get housing, transitional housing, things like that. So, the population we work with, again, juvenile lifers, former life sentence children, and a lot of them are doing good, but a lot of things are happening in this time to affect them like they're doing everyone, but just coming out of prison, it's very hard coming into a world like this. You're locked down, you can't go anywhere, you don't know what to do, so I just think that the emotional impact that this has had and going to have on people, I think is something I hope that we can look into more also, because I think as people move on in their life, these things can linger emotionally if they're not addressed. So I think that's, again, one of the most important things to me, a person's well-being, the emotional health, well-being. So I just think for me, I would like to see, more research in that area also.
Thanks, Eddie. So that kind of closes out the fifth round. So now we're going to, for the remaining time period for the panel, we're going to go to the Q&A session. And so for the panelists, for this, if you could all turn on your video feed, and so that you're all up there. And then I'm going to pose a question that comes from the audience. And rather than do a one person at a time kind of thing, y'all can maybe more organically and spontaneously respond to each other if y'all like to do that. And so here's the question. I'll open it up. Although now I have to check my what I wrote down. Here it is. Okay, so this is from an audience member. So the question is, what are the unique challenges for emerging adults in these systems during the COVID-19 pandemic? And in this context, an emerging adult is someone who's generally defined between the ages of 18 and 24 or 25 or so. So I'll just repeat the question one more time. what are the unique challenges for emerging adults in these systems during the COVID-19 pandemic? And if anyone has thoughts on that, feel free to hop in.
I think for me, what I have seen and continue to see in these situations is the fear of being sick. People continue to be locked down, lack of communication with family, lack of resources inside institutions, not being able to social distance while in these institutions. And for the children who are charged as an adults being held in these facilities, they are normally in solitary confinement anyway, quote unquote, for their own protection. So I think that, people are saying they're being locked down more and it's more harmful to them than anything. So I just think that's some of the residual effects that can come from this COVID situation in my eyes.
So other thoughts? So again, the question being, do y'all see any unique challenges for emerging adults, I guess specifically that population, in the juvenile justice system during the COVID-19 pandemic, or I guess the justice system more broadly?
Yeah, I think some of the unique challenges are a lot of times when we have, for our probation system, what we do and expect is for people to become, upstanding economic actors and, job searches and tie a lot of really punitive punishments to folks who are unable to find jobs or participate in the right kind of programming. So I really think that we're coming into a time when the world is not well equipped to be able to absorb folks from emerging adults who are coming back into the community. And I don't know whether or not the criminal justice system and the probation system is going to be able to catch up quickly enough in order to really modify what their expectations are, which will just lead to reincarceration. Those are my concerns.
And I think, if I can jump into, I guess the only thing I'd want to highlight is just that, these are sort of among the most vulnerable populations in the United States. And especially for youth who are, crossover youth, the consequences of being incredibly vulnerable, getting handed back and forth between systems, and dealing with a pandemic simultaneously are just going to be overwhelmingly difficult, and are going to require a tremendous amount of collaboration across institutions and social service providers that I think we almost never, or at least very rarely, see. So, I think that's the unique piece, is the level of precarity interacting with institutional contact and a pandemic.
Awesome. So another follow-up question, or another question from the audience. This one is, do you see any pressures for the justice system to keep youth on the juvenile side of the fence, meaning fewer transfers, more use of extended jurisdiction? So again, do you see any pressures for the justice system to keep youth on the juvenile side of the fence, I guess, in the current pandemic?
I think, if you think about it in terms of protection of the population that's incarcerated, like not transferring anyone right now is probably, I know I'm not an epidemiologist or have any broad knowledge, but I would think that like you want the juvenile population and the adult population now to be separated, right? Because like anyone who's gone to prison has seen, older vulnerable inmates, right? And I think that's just a huge health risk, like any kind of mixing between this population. And then again, I would think that the pressure is already there. Like we know that the outcomes for juveniles who are transferred are incredibly are not as good as for those who are able to stay in the juvenile justice system. So that should be pressure enough, right? But I think with the pandemic, the minimizing the contact between low risk and high risk population has been the approach that was, taken globally, and probably that I would assume that's something that the criminal justice system also strives for.
So any other thoughts on that? The idea that there might be pressure to keep juveniles on the juvenile side of the fence? And if not, I have another follow-up from the Q&A. So I'll just pause for a moment. Okay, so here's another question. This is again from the audience. And so the person who asked this question notes that there are a lot of different people in the audience that come from different backgrounds. And the person who posed the question asks, are there any recommendations or suggestions, both general and specific to the varied backgrounds of the people listening in right now? Are there any recommendations or suggestions for what we can begin doing today to address the issues that have been highlighted? So I guess things that have come up during the course of this panel, if you, the panelists, have thoughts about things that people who are listening in right now might be able to do today to begin addressing some of those issues.
Yeah, I have two things. First one is to listen to the voices who have been through this system, because at this moment right now, they are being, they're trying to be heard, and I think that we absolutely owe it to the folks who have been through this system to listen to what they're saying, to listen with honesty to what they're saying. The second thing from a nerdy 30,000-foot perspective is that the Reentry Act that was passed inside the HEROES Act is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Not only is it something that's been demonstrated to be inexpensive by the CBO, but it's also something that I think would radically change the way the health system and the correctional systems interact. It would allow for the construction of a system that can ignore the walls of the jail, because it'll allow for reach-in and allow for Medicaid to fund reentry services in ways that it never has before. So I really do think that, and at this moment in time when we're thinking about the connections between public health and public safety, a provision that doesn't expand Medicaid, but actually allows for the Medicaid benefits to flow to people who are already eligible beneficiaries is something that I think that we can really we can have happen at this moment. But we just have to get the information out there while we're all trying to drink out of this fire hose of information that's coming through. So I think anybody in a Republican state who wants to contact their Republican senator, or Democratic senators who have good relationships with Republican senators, I'm happy to help inform this conversation, because I think that conversation needs to be happening, and we've got about a month-and-a-half window for it.
I guess the thing I would say is just, and I mean, maybe this is totally naive, but just making it really clear to folks working in those systems that transitioning folks out now is likely to be as easy or easier than trying to do it in a couple months. So I think starting to think about ways that we can get foster youth out of the system who don't necessarily need to be in the system, starting to think about ways that we can decrease juvenile sentences in ways that transition folks out more rapidly. I just think, I think there are folks who are worried about sort of opening things up too quickly in terms of trying to get folks out of systems. And I think the sooner we do it, the better. So
I've been, when I was in Chicago, I worked with a group that sort of indirectly made it into my dissertation. It was like a Catholic group, and I was very skeptical because I'm a former Catholic, but like what they just sent out a message after during the protests against police brutality, and they're working with kids that are, you know, extremely difficult to work with, that most of them are involved in the juvenile justice system. You know, many have also done, like, you know, not so great things. They have, you know, they use guns, they are in gangs, and they're just, you know, a very difficult population, but they nevertheless provide a space for these youth, right? And I think, or, you know, that like now that everyone is sort of aware of, on one hand, the pandemic and how this has increased inequality, and then the violence that, you know, young Black men experience, I mean, that wouldn't that be a time where we could move away from retribution, right? And like really think about, like, not, and move away from this like ideal image of, oh, you know, everyone is innocent and like they were all incarcerated, you know, accidentally, but like, no, people have made mistakes, and, you know, like that doesn't mean that we need to incarcerate them for an extremely long time. And I think that's why I find this work in Germany so interesting, because like I just finished a paper, and I compared the sentence lengths, and of course the sentence length in Germany was much shorter than in the US, and the crimes they committed were like, you know, roughly equivalent. And so I think if like this could be a moment where like we rethink retribution and really move toward this sort of restorative justice that, you know, the center that I worked at like is trying to advocate, right? Because like this is not, it's not useful, has not gotten us anything. It's that, you know, it's, and, you know, now that resources are extremely strained, you know, maybe it is a time to acknowledge the reality of these youth and their complexity and their struggles, and still say, you know what, like, you still have a right to be part of this society, and we still try to help you. And you know, maybe in a moment of crisis, this is something that can happen.
Thanks, everybody. We'll do one last Q&A question, I think. Eddie, I don't know if you specifically might have thoughts on this or not, but I'll share it with everybody. So here's the question from someone in the audience. In the interest of policy change, do any of you or your groups have plans to put out research briefs or other documents to help ensure that we get better policies in place over the summer? Parenthetically, thinking ahead to preventing some of this when there is a second wave. Can we move quickly to try to shift policy to change or avoid harmful reactive kinds of responses?
Well, I know the legal department at the Campaign for the Fair Sentence and Youth are helping nationwide with a lot of different policy things, sign on and supporting a lot of different things. But I think with our situation of fighting, you know, in certain states at this time to try to ban life without parole for children and other hard sentences for children, you know, some of the work has been scaled back because we can't be there, but we're still doing what we can to communicate and get things done as best as we can, getting the support from people in the community. But I just think that we're in a very difficult time. It's gonna be very hard, and a lot of things going to take precedent over other things because of the pandemic and what, you know, some people think is very important. But I know that my legal department is still doing a lot of things around a lot of policy stuff as we speak right now to help ban life without parole for children. So it's still happening, and if anyone want to be connected with them, I can give the information for people to be connected with my legal department.
And again, the question's open to anybody, but just given the nature of the question and the respective backgrounds of the panelists, Dan, do you have any particular reactions to this question?
So COACHES is going to be putting out a fact sheet around the Reentry Act coming up very quickly. So if anybody wants to get on our media scan, you can go to our website, coaches.org, in order to get that. And you can always email me to dmistak@coaches.org. And we'd be happy to share that. We've also been working with policymakers in the background, because my main fear is that a lot of folks who might be having COVID symptoms and need a level of care that is not available inside of a jail are just going to end up suffering alone inside of jails. So we've been trying to work on some of the policy issues that allow for a reach in inside the jail. We've got a policy brief around that. It's a really nerdy Medicaid 1135 waiver paper. And a few states have picked that up in order to work with that, in order to allow hospital level of care, which is a much higher level of care that it's allowed inside of that happens inside of a jail normally, or also to provide like surge capacity in order to make sure that we've at least created the playing field where people could receive higher levels of care than they normally receive inside of jurisdictions, so that jurisdictions won't have any excuse if they don't respond to the legitimate medical needs of the individuals who are right now incarcerated.
Thanks, Dan. We just have a few more minutes before Giza, Dr. Lopez, is going to step in for final remarks. And so I'll ask one last question from the Q&A for any of the panelists, if they have thoughts. Are there any Are there any success stories or innovative practices that you can share aside from decarceration? So are there any success stories or innovative practices that you can share aside from decarceration?
Success stories, I would say some of these life without parole bills being banned and having so many former life sentence children who was banned, given life without parole to die in jail. That's home, that's mothers, that's fathers, that's taxpaying citizens, and that's living right now, and that's going good. And under campaign for the fair sentencing youth, we have over 150 members of former life sentence children and children sentenced to harsh sentences. So for me, that's a wonderful story of people getting a chance, not a second chance, but a first chance. They was children when they was sentenced to life or these hard sentences, from the first place. But we are doing good, and we are doing, more work to help other people come home. So for me, that's a success story.
Thanks, Eddie. Any other responses to that? So just success stories or innovative practices that you can share aside from decarceration?
So I like the work that I do in Germany is focused, or I'm also interviewing juveniles in prison. And what's unique about Germany is that we have this very robust apprenticeship system, right? And like the juveniles who are incarcerated in Germany, they have the ability to enroll in an apprenticeship program, and get then after that, there's it's sort of intertwined. So after this, they start their apprenticeship. Most of them can't finish it in the prison system because they get released earlier. An apprenticeship is 3 years. Most of the kids, even those who are incarcerated for child abuse and rape, are getting released earlier. So they get released, and then they transition into an apprenticeship on the outside. Right, so that it's a sort of seamless transition, and so they come out, they have money saved because they get paid. They don't get paid much, but they have money saved. They are able to then immediately continue the education that they had in prison on the outside. And for some people that doesn't work because it's very difficult to it's actually very difficult to maintain the level of commitment to an apprenticeship, and it's also uncomfortable because you have to get up early in the morning and whatever, and that's much harder on the outside than on the inside. But I think that's a very good example of a sort of seamless, in an ideal situation, seamless transition.
Thanks, Michi. Thanks everybody. I think that brings us just about to the end of our time, so I'm gonna turn my stuff off, and Dr. Lopez will have the final word.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks for your skillful moderation of this very thought-provoking panel. Thanks to all the panelists. I want to revisit a couple of the highlights, at least for me, that came out of this. Michi, I thoroughly appreciated you creating a space to talk about qualitative research and the barriers that we have in a moment of crisis like this to go around IRB and other obstacles. But how qualitative research really moving forward in a moment of crisis can help us understand what's coming down the pike, right? Instead of just being an illustration of more statistical inferences. So thanks for that. Dan, I was really enlightened by some of the Medicaid related issues that you referred to as nerdy. I thought maybe I'm a nerd too. I just think that this is a very important conversation to put out there. So thank you for doing that. But thanks also for calling attention to one thing that I think you said, and I'm apologizing in advance if I'm butchering. I'll try to paraphrase as closely as possible. What I think you said was that COVID has done for us is force people to pay attention to the longstanding inequalities within multiple systems. And you made that point several times, to reach across silos and to understand the world as it is, as a holistic thing, a messy thing, and not necessarily separated conjunction of systems, right? I really appreciated that point. So thank you. Chris, to you, I know you have to hop off a couple of minutes before. Thanks for keeping it real. You were struggling with your kids there. I'm struggling with my dogs and my kids also. So thank you. Thank you also for reminding us not to be too hyper-focused and myopic on the crisis that's happening right now, but also preserve our eyesight and interest in the much bigger issues that preceded this and that are exacerbated by this crisis, right? So thanks for that. Eddie, I can't stress enough the point that you made about resilience. I think that what you said resonates much of what has been discussed since Tuesday throughout all of the panels. So thank you for that. And thank you especially for calling out the fact that we need funding and resources for emotional support organizations right now. I couldn't agree with you more, especially due to the compounding trauma that we're all going through, but certain groups in particular. So thanks to all of you very, very much. I'm losing my voice. I apologize. I'm struggling with allergies. Life continues. We are coming back tomorrow with two amazing speakers, Michael and Pierre and Professor John Powell, as well as a cross-panel conversation that will summarize everything that's being discussed to the extent that we can throughout this forum. And in the afternoon, or rather at 11:30, I keep getting this wrong, we have a round with researchers and funders. I hope you can join us for all of it, some of it, and until then, thank you very, very much.